Welcome to Murder by Nature, where we discuss true crime, mysterious disappearances, and unsolved cases. I'm Jasmine, your host. Well, thank you for coming back and watching part 3 of the true story behind Love and Death, the series on Max. In last week's episode, we discussed the affair of Candy and Allan, beginning and the end. We left off with them parting ways and really trying to work on their marriages. In this week's episode, we'll be diving into the tragedy that took place from the actions of this infidelity. I'm going to put a warning here. This episode will be graphic, and it's not suitable for all audiences. We'll be discussing the murder and details of that event, and the leading up and following of the event. So please, if this is something that you're not into, I would skip this episode. And I would maybe even skip part 4, because we do go into the trial in part 4. But it does have details of the case. As a working mother of 2, Betty had a lot on her plate, but what really put a strain on her life was the postpartum depression she suffered after giving birth to her second daughter in 1979. She didn't want to be alone, not even for a single night, which meant that when Allan had to travel out of town to St. Paul, Minnesota for a weekend for work in the summer of 1980, Betty wasn't happy. This, combined with his wife's usual routine of keeping the girls busy, is why Allan didn't initially worry when his wife didn't pick up his expected call from the airport on April 13, 1980. Now, once, Allan went on such a trip, and when he did, Betty had an affair with a young boy. Her actions hurt Allan, but what made him more concerned was that she indulged only because she wanted to teach Allan a lesson, make him feel insecure. She wanted Allan to repent his actions. But what would any man have to be sorry for about going on a business trip if he was not doing anything that would be wrong? Now, Betty suffered from severe postpartum depression, and after the birth of her second child, she just didn't want to go through the entire ordeal again. And things were slowly starting to get better between Betty and Allan. When he left for work on the trip once again, Allan tried not to worry about the fact that Betty was not answering the phone, even though he felt like something was wrong. Now, Candy was at church with her children, and Lisa, Betty and Allan's daughter, spent the night at their house the day before. Candy was talking with the other church ladies when her daughter asked if Lisa can go with them to the movies that night to go see the new Star Wars. Candy didn't mind at all, but she knew that if Lisa was going to be joining them, that she would have to ask Betty to pick up her swimsuit from her house, as Lisa did have swim lessons that evening. The children were in Bible study, and Candy decided that she would go to the Gore house real fast to pick up the swimsuit and ask Betty if it was okay for her to go to the movies with them and stay the night. When Candy arrived at the Gore house, she walked up and knocked on the door. Betty opened the door, and she was a little scattered, but let Candy in. They chatted calmly for some time about different topics, and as Candy was preparing to leave, Betty asked her, "Candy, are you having an affair with Allan?" "No, of course not," Candy said. "But you did, didn't you?" Not sure what to say, Candy confessed too, and told Betty that the infidelity happened a long time ago and that it was over. Betty got up and left the room and entered the utility room, returning with an axe. "I don't ever want you to see him again. You can't have him," Betty said. "Betty, don't be ridiculous. It was over a long time ago." Betty left the axe against the wall and started to calm down. And as the room started to feel less tense, Candy picked up Alyssa's swimsuit to leave. Candy reached out and put her hand on Betty's arm and said, "I'm so sorry." That sentence triggered Betty. She pushed her into the utility room, picking up the axe again, and said, "You can't have him. You can't have him. I've got to kill you." Betty started hitting Candy's head. Candy managed to avoid being hit seriously, and she took the axe from her hands and used the blade on Betty in self-defense before her friend could attack her again. She hit Betty. In terror that she killed Betty, Candy tried to leave the room. Before she could do so, Betty stopped her by slamming her body against the door. Candy pleaded for her life, and in response, Betty shushed her. And then something in Candy snapped. She wrestled the axe from Betty and started swinging. Betty wouldn't stay down, so Candy swung again, and again, and again. In shock of what just happened, Candy got in the shower, leaving bloody handprints around the house, and rinsed the blood off of her. The toe on Candy's left foot was bleeding profusely. Candy stared at it, and she fished in her purse for the keys to the station wagon. Candy spoke to herself. "Now you're in the car. You're normal. Your car is still here. Everything looks the same." Candy was trying to go through the motions, unsure of what to do. She took one step at a time, just doing one thing at a time, telling herself, don't think about the house. She stared down the main street of Wiley and imagined that her car was not moving at all. She glanced down at her lap and felt a sudden chill in her leg. Her blue jeans were soaked with water. And now the smell of the fabric was flooding her nostrils, and for a moment she thought she would be sick. Why am I wet? That smell. Can't panic. Normal. Left, right. Why won't the car go faster? After a while, she pulled back onto the road at FM 1378 and continued north past an old church and a red schoolhouse. Once Candy arrived at her home, her station wagon nosed into the double garage and stopped. Candy knew that she had to get out of these clothes. She ran upstairs, stripping off her blouse, blue jeans, and she entered the bedroom. She wiped the blood off her third toe and wrapped it with a Band-Aid tightly, flinching as she felt how deep the cut was. I did it on the storm door, she told herself. She took her shirt into the kitchen and placed it in the sink. She poured detergent and turned on the water, and she left the blouse soaking in the sink and went upstairs to find a pair of jeans, the same shade as the one she had just taken off. She took a quick shower, washed her hair, and as she did, she noticed an open cut on her hairline. Now, she tried to dry it with a towel and then went to go find a Band-Aid. But since it was on the hairline, the bandage wouldn't stick. Her hair was in the way. Finally, she gave up, wringed out her blouse, and put on the new blue jeans. She threw the old ones in the washer and waited while the dryer dried her blouse. The last thing she did was replace her rubber sandals with a pair of blue tennis shoes. She laced them up so tightly to keep pressure on the toe bandage and left her home and headed back to church. The children's puppet show in the sanctuary ended when Candy pulled into the parking lot. She caught up with a friend who was going in to join the other woman for lunch. "Oh, Barbara," Candy said breathlessly. "I went down to Betty's and we just got to talking, and then I looked at my watch and I thought I had time to go to Target and get Father's Day cards, and I drove all the way to Plano, but then when I got there, I realized my watch had stopped and I was late, so I didn't even go in. We're taking Alyssa with us tonight to see The Empire Strikes Back. That reminds me, I better go check on the kids." As Candy headed for the classroom, it crossed her mind that she might be limping. She made a special effort to walk straight. In an empty room, she found a mirror and dabbed the cut at the hairline. Even after the blood had been kind of dried, she could feel it running down her forehead. As Candy was walking to the classroom, one of the women noticed something odd. Candy, who always wore rubber sandals in the summer, was wearing a pair of blue tennis shoes. The afternoon passed in a fog. Candy bundled the three children up into the station wagon. They were oddly comfortable. That was the one thing that helped her get through everything that was going on in her head. At home, after she told Alyssa to get ready for her swimming lesson, while Candy phoned Pat at work, "Pat, we just got home from Bible study, and we want to make sure you get enough money at the bank because Alyssa's going with us to the movies. The kids nagged about it after you left this morning, so I promised I'm going to ask Betty if Alyssa can go and stay the night again. But then I had to go to Betty's to pick up the swimsuit, and we got to talking, and I lost track of time, and then I went to Target, and I noticed my watch had stopped working. I missed the whole Bible school program." "Uh-huh," Pat said. He had just returned back to the Texas Instruments office picnic and was anxious to get some computer runs. Betty said Alyssa can go and spend the night. "Listen, honey, that's fine with me. I'm about to go to the bank now. Pat, would you happen to know where Allan is working today?" "Allan Gore?" "No. Why?" "It's not that important. I'll meet you in the parking lot about 5:05. Pat hung up and thought, what the heck was that? But he continued with his day. Maybe she's just having a weird day. At 410 Dogwood Street, the home of Allan and Betty Gore, their two children, and their two Cocker Spaniels, no one came or went on the afternoon of June 13th, 1980. The phone rang and rang, but wasn't answered. Around noon, a delivery man with a parcel service rang the doorbell, but got no response. Around 4 p.m., Allan Gore called from the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, where he was about to board a plane for his business trip, and it rang 10 or 11 rings before he hung up. The only sign that the house had someone in there was the muffled sound from within of a baby crying at the top of her lungs. Behind the house, the dogs skittered nervously around the yard, howling and whimpering as if they were confused or perhaps frightened. Candy's son talked excitedly about Star Wars, but Candy wasn't listening. She and the children sat in the parking lot at Texas Instruments with the windows of the station wagon rolled down to get some of that heat of the summer air. and waited for Pat's conference to break so they can go to the movies. The children were talking in the back seat, and out of nowhere, Candy heard the name, Bethany. Candy didn't know what the children were talking about, probably something about brothers and sisters, but she heard Alyssa say her baby sister's name, and suddenly Candy's body tensed all over again. The sense of dread rushed back to her, and it came with the strong aroma of that same smell, tickling her nose and going into her sinuses. Allan Gore had left for St. Paul that afternoon. Back in September, when he left Rockwell International to join a new company in Richardson, he had known he would have to work long hours, but he really tried to avoid working weekends. This time, Allan and 2 of his colleagues had to be in Minnesota over the weekend to make sure one of their largest clients had a full functioning machine switch system by next week. But Allan wasn't enjoying this particular trip, and for a familiar reason. Betty couldn't stand to be left alone, even for one night. This trip would have been easier on her because of the vacation they were planning. A week from now, they would be in Europe without the children for the first time in 4 years. And last night, she was positively radiant, describing the upcoming trip as their second honeymoon. Then this morning, she had broke down again. But she and Allan had a good talk and parted happily. Allan promised to call her from the airport. The sound of his voice would reassure her. On the way to the gate, he stopped at the payphone and dialed home. The phone rang 7 or so times, then he hung up and dialed again. But when he got no answer, he assumed that Betty was taking an afternoon walk with Bethany. Just then, he saw one of his colleagues and joined him in the boarding area. Before 8, the men had checked into their hotel and would agree to meet for dinner around 9. Allan sat on his bed in his room, going over the day, wondering, did he forget something? Was Betty supposed to do something? He called the house again, and the phone rang 15 times. And then he called the operator, and they dialed the number. Still no answer. Betty could be moody, but she would never leave the house in the evening without telling anyone. Allan called Richard, his next-door neighbor, the real estate agent who sold them the house. When Richard answered, Allan could hear small children in the background. "Richard, this is Allan Gore. Sorry to bother you, but I'm out of town and I've been trying to get Betty on the phone. I think the phone must be out of order. Would you mind going and knocking on the door to see if anyone's home?" "Yeah, okay, partner," said Richard. "I guess I can run over there, just to see if she's home." He slipped out the front door and hurried across the Gore lawn in his bare foot. Richard pounded hard on the door and waited for an answer. He rang the doorbell, he waited a few more seconds, and then he sprinted back across the grass. "No answer, Allan. She must be out." "Okay," Allan said. "Thanks for checking. I'll call her later." Now, Allan was really starting to worry, and with no other options, he dialed the Montgomery number. Candy answered after one ring. "Candy, this is Allan. Have you seen Betty?" "Oh, Allan, where are you?" "I'm in Minnesota on a business trip. I've been trying to get Betty, but no answers. I thought you might have talked to her today." "I saw her this morning when I went to go pick up Alyssa's swimsuit. Did Betty seem all right?" "She was fine. She did act like she was in a hurry for me to leave." "Do you know where she might be?" "Maybe she went to a friend's." "No, she wouldn't go out this late. It scares her." "Well, I'm sure there's nothing wrong." Candy's voice was full of concern. "When I went over to pick up Alyssa's bathing suit, she was okay. I remember she was sewing, and we talked for a while, and she gave some peppermints for Alyssa. She told me that she wouldn't put her head under the water unless she got a peppermint afterwards. So I took the peppermints and left." "Is Alyssa there now?" Candy called Alyssa to the phone. Allan asked about the swim lessons and asked whether her mom had mentioned going anywhere that afternoon. Alyssa didn't remember anything, so Allan told her to have a good time and be polite to the Montgomerys. Then Candy back on the line. "Allan, is there anything I can do? I'd be happy to go over to the house and check on them for you." "No, that's all right. I'll call the neighbors." A few moments later, Allan went downstairs to the hotel restaurant when he decided that he was going to return back to his room around 10 o'clock. Way past Betty's bedtime. He decided to call again, but still, no answer at home. With the fear growing stronger, Allan called Richard again and asked him to see if Betty's car was in the driveway. Richard went as far as the chain fence link between their houses and peered into the garage. Sorry, I know I just said driveway, but I mean garage. Then he went back to the phone and said, "Yeah, Allan, there's only one car in there and the garage is open, the lights are on." "That's strange," said Allan. As he considered all the possibilities, he decided it had to be some emergency. Perhaps the baby was sick. He called the Plano Hospital and the Wiley police, but they never heard of Betty Gore. At the same time, this started to grow later and later in the day, and he was spiraling. He needed to talk to someone with a calm, level head, a sympathetic ear. So he called Candy. Again. One car's gone. The garage door's open. The lights are on. She never leaves the garage door open. Has she called there or anything? Oh, Allan, no, she hasn't. Let me go down there and check the house. Or let me check the hospitals for you. No. I just want to make sure you didn't remember anything else. I'll get the neighbors to check again. Don't worry about Alyssa, Allan. We have her and she's fine. Allan hung up and felt sick. Why didn't Betty call him? Why didn't anyone know anything? Why couldn't he make the one phone call that would make everything all right? For the third time, he dialed Richard's house. This time, he didn't waste words. Richard, I'm really worried about her. Please go back over there and check all the doors in the garage again. If she had to leave in a hurry, maybe she left a note somewhere. Richard sighed. He didn't like the responsibility and was frightened by Allan's panic. But he went all the way back to the back fence, into the alley, and up the Gore driveway. He was startled to see 2 cars in the driveway. The Volkswagen Rabbit was pulled so far up that he hadn't been able to see it from the fence. Richard walked into the garage and tried to open the door to the utility room. He could see the light under the door, but it was locked. Something about the house, the burning lights, the open garage, the silence disturbed him, and he couldn't go any further and rushed back home. Something's wrong, Allan. I don't know what, but something's wrong. Both cars are there and the lights are on, but no one's answering. Richard, Allan said, I want you to go, and I want you to get into the house any way you can. Richard didn't say anything for a moment. Okay, Allan, I guess so. Call me back when you find something out. Here, write down my number. Richard took down the number and hung up and took a deep breath. He paused for a moment and then went to find his keys, hoping he had one that fit the Gore's house. Now, while Allan waited for Richard, he kind of grew skeptical. Richard didn't really sound like he could do this. He sounded scared and unsure if he wanted to help. So Allan decided to call Jerry, who lived across the alley from the Gores. Jerry, something's wrong at my house. I've been trying to get Betty, but no one's answering. The lights are on, the doors are locked. Will you get a flashlight and go over there and see what you can find out? Okay, I'll be back in a minute. Jerry stepped into his jumpsuit and his house shoes and started down his driveway with a flashlight. He knocked loudly on the utility room door in Allan's garage, but got no answer. Then he walked back into the backyard and tried to force open the sliding door, but it wouldn't budge. He continued around the front of the house, peered into the windows as he went, and rang the doorbell, but still no sign of life. Back at his own home, he told Allan, the lights are on in there, but I can't see anything wrong. Jerry, there's something definitely wrong. She's probably just out with friends. No, she's not with friends. I've already tried that. Get in that house and see what's wrong. Take the windows off, force the doors, whatever it takes. As soon as Jerry told his wife what was happening, she grew frightened and insisted that he not go over there alone. So Jerry called Lester, a barber who lived next door to the Gores on the other side of Richard. 2 minutes later, the two friends met in the alley behind the Gores' house, when Richard walked out into the yard carrying a big silver ring of house keys. He was startled to see Jerry and Lester. What the hell's going on? Jerry asked. I don't know, he said. Gore just called and said to get into the house. I've got the realtor keys. Let's try them on the doors. The 3 men walked up the Gore's driveway while Richard tried his keys on the utility door one by one. Jerry and Lester tried to open up the sliding door again. It was the 5th time the house had been checked that night, and by doing so, the group invested a process with seriousness that made them a little uncomfortable. If there was something wrong inside, they weren't sure if they wanted to see it. Unfortunately, none of Richard's keys worked. Out of options, one of the men suggested they try the front window of the homes. Together, they walked around the side street of the house, and Jerry and Lester inspected the large window in the dining room to see if it would pry open. Richard went to the front door with his realtor keys again. As he placed the first key in the lock, a chill ran down his spine. The door swung open. He hadn't even turned the key. This door, he said, turning to Jerry and Lester and stepping away for a moment. This door is not locked. The 2 men joined Richard at the porch, but for a moment, no one made a move to go in. Richard stuck his head into the crack of the door. Betty, he said, then louder, Betty. Finally, Leslie pushed open the door, and the 3 men entered the foyer. It was lit. The lights were burning, the den to the right and the bathroom to the left. All the lights were on. All the hallway doors were closed, though. Lester stopped at the first one and opened it, flipped the light on inside. Richard looked over the shoulder, and it was a child's bedroom. Nothing unusual. They continued down the hallway to the next room. Jerry peered into the bathroom, and on the tile, he saw a dark, caked substance. Oh no, he said. Something bad is wrong. In the second bedroom, They opened the door and flipped on the light. As soon as he did, Richard heard the howling of an abandoned child, and they just stopped. Oh my God, the baby. From the doorway, Richard can see Bethany in her crib, half sitting, half laying, her legs folded under hers, her face blotchy and red, her hair tangled and dirty. Her skin was stained with her own feces. Her hoarse crying curdled their blood. She had obviously been there for a long time. Richard gathered up the baby, cradling her head against his shoulder, and hurried back to his house to call the police. As Richard left, Jerry and Lester went to the master bedroom where they found nothing. With nerves racing, the man knew there was only one other part of the home that they can check. The other side. After finding the baby in the bloodstained bathroom, they anxiously entered the living room. And Jerry went to the dining room on the right while Lester took the kitchen on the left. They walked slowly, turning on the lights as they went by, both of them increasingly aware of the pungent odor that seemed to follow them through the house. Finally, Leslie made his way to the kitchen and then through to the utility door. "Oh my God, don't go any further," he said, shutting the door quickly, and then the stunned silence of the moment. It was too difficult to tell whether he was talking to Jerry or to himself or to someone on the other side of the door. "She's dead." He hadn't seen the body. He hadn't seen anything but thick blood. Reddish-brown seas of blood flooding the tile of the utility room, and he didn't want to look any further. From the dining room, Jerry saw the look on his face and heard the shock in his voice and walked over, cautiously to the door. As Lester moved away, Jerry cracked the door open and without getting in closer, looked in. He only got a glimpse, but it was enough. He shut the door. "She's blown her head off," he said. He went to the telephone on the kitchen counter, thinking he could call the police, but just as he was about to pick up the receiver, the phone rang. For an instant, Jerry and Lester froze. Lester picked it up. "Hello? This is Allan." He had called because he couldn't wait any longer. Lester hesitated. Jerry sensed what was happening. "Is that Allan?" he asked. He handed him the phone. "What did you find?" Allan's voice tense and shaky. "I'm afraid it's not good," said Jerry, finding no words to describe what he had just seen. "Don't worry, the little one's okay." "The baby's okay?" "Yes." "What about Betty?" "I'm sorry, Allan." "What happened?" Jerry had to say something. "I don't know for sure." "What do you think?" "It looks like she's been shot." "How? We don't have a gun." "I'm sorry, Allan. I wish I had another way to say it." After a silence, Jerry said, "What about Alyssa, Allan? Do you know where she is?" "Yeah, she's fine. She's fine." "I wish there was something I could say, Allan. We'll stay here and explain everything to the police." "Okay, thanks, Jerry." Allan was stunned and a little bit disoriented. He had temporarily forgot where he was. Not knowing what else to do, he called Candy Montgomery again. Pat was a little frustrated when the phone rang at 11:30. He and Candy had just started making love. "What timing," he said, as Candy reached immediately for the phone. "Candy," Allan's voice was distant and flat. "I have some bad news. Betty's dead." "Oh, Allan," Candy's voice broke. "What happened?" "It looks like she's been shot. The neighbors found her." "What about Bethany?" Allan didn't even hear the question. "I know there have been some bad things bothering her lately," he said, "and I know she's been upset. She was 2 weeks late on her period, but I never thought that she would." Allan stopped, and Pat noticed tears forming in Candy's eyes. "What can I say, Allan?" Candy was almost whimpering. "Please keep Alyssa for a while and don't tell her what happened. I want to tell her." "Oh, Allan, are you going to be all right?" "Yes, I'm okay. I've got to go." Candy hung up and began to sob. Pat put his arms around her shoulders. "Is she dead?" he asked. "I don't know. I didn't ask." "How can you ask something like that?" "But she must have been, because the neighbor found her." A gun, she thought. A suicide. Allan Gore wondered who he should call next. He stared at the wall, and his mind went blank for a moment. Then he saw Betty, as he'd seen her for the last time that morning, as he would see her for months to come. She had walked out into the driveway with Bethany in her arms. As Allan pulled out, she raised Bethany's little hand and waved it at him. And for the first time that day, Betty had smiled. Really smiled. When the police arrived at the Gore home, they walked to the small room, no more than 12 feet long by 6 feet wide, made smaller by the appearance of a washer, a dryer, a freezer, and a small cabinet where Betty kept toys and knickknacks. In one corner were a brand new toy wagon and a child's training toilet. Closer to the center of the room, where the freezer stood against one wall, there were 2 dog food bowls and a bruised book by Mother Goose nursery rhymes. Her left hand was the first thing they noticed after opening the door. It laid in a pool of blood so thick that the arm appeared to be floating above the floor. To get a look at her face, the men had to walk around the ocean of red and black to get closer. What they saw was even more unsettling. Her lips were parted, showing her front teeth. The mouth fashioned into a half grin. Her hair radiated in all directions, a tangle-soaked mass of glistening black. And Betty's left eye was wide open, staring down at the gaping black craters in her arm. As to her right eye, it appeared that she didn't have one. The entire right side of her face seemed to be gone. And a few feet from Betty's head was a half-concealed, under the freezer, wooden, heavy, 3-foot-long axe. Candy Montgomery slept for 3 hours and then got up alone to fix breakfast. Pat and the children and Alyssa Gore were still sleeping. She and Pat had stayed up talking about Betty for a while, and then Pat was unable to get any information from the police and they gave up, laying and staring at the ceiling. They tried to sleep. Pat fell asleep first, but Candy kept thinking about the last phone call from Allan. After telling them that Betty had been shot, he called back to give them his flight schedule. Before hanging up, he said something else. "I've talked to the police and I've mentioned that you were over there, so they'll probably be calling." It was the first time Candy had thought about it. Candy went through the rituals of a normal housewife that day, making the bed, putting away toys. She called softly to the children to get up, and they limped down the stairs for breakfast. Pat was outside mowing the lawn, and the kids were finishing eating and ran out to play. Then the phone call started. "Candy, have you heard about Betty?" "Just that she was shot." "Well, don't turn on the radio where Alyssa can hear. I haven't heard it, but I understand it's all over the news." "Oh, is it?" Candy felt a twitch. She stared straight ahead. "Thank you for letting us know." The phone rang again, almost as soon as Candy hung up. Since it was Saturday, everyone was home listening to the radios and trading information by phone. "Candy, do you know what Betty said? We heard last night. It's so awful. The police just left. They said she was boarded with an axe." And with a few short words, Candy's heart stopped. An axe? It must have been some sick, very sick person. The telephone wouldn't stop ringing. Unsure of what to do, Candy went into the yard and got the hedge trimmers and started trimming the shrubs around the white fence. It was hard, messy work, and she pinched into it wholeheartedly, rubbing blisters on her hand from pressing the clipper so hard. She fielded more calls, many of them shocked church members who actually called the woman who seemed to have all the information. Who could have done such a diseased crime? Who had that mind to use a weapon like that? If they ever catch the person who did this, there's nothing that he couldn't do that would be punishment enough. I just hate that Betty suffered. They said that there was bloody footprints. The bloody footprint was fast becoming the sole detail of the crime known to every person in Collin County. And around lunchtime, the calls began to slow down. A friend reported that Allan was home and that he was told that Betty had been killed with an axe, and he almost collapsed. Candy sat by the kitchen table, the phone cradled between her ear and shoulder, a pair of garden shears in her hand, and as she spoke, she worked on the garden shears back and forth, pressing with all her might as the blade cut through a pair of rubber sandals. She continued her work for several minutes, not long enough though, as she started to destroy the patterns on the soles, rendering the shoes into a mess of rubber. After hanging up the phone, she gathered the scraps and then she carried them outside to the garbage can. By afternoon, the police asked Candy to come down to the station to discuss the events that happened that afternoon with Betty. Candy's own report stated that she was the last person to see Betty alive. The police who investigated Betty Gore's death could not believe that anyone as small as Candy Montgomery had the physical strength to wield that axe so brutally. So during the first initial interviews, they were just going through the motions of every interview, thinking that a man came back into that house and performed a brutal act. Maybe it was Satanists. All of that was happening around this time. That's what they kept thinking. As the police grew suspicious about Candy, they still found it hard to believe that this pretty, vibrant, utterly normal suburban housewife could make such a vicious attack. She was a loving mother, a devoted wife, a churchgoer, and everyone's friend. She was really as normal and likable and good as she appeared, except one dark corner of her soul that she didn't even know existed. Police continued to follow up on leads and questioned anyone possible, but they kept coming back to Candy. She was the last one to see Betty alive, and no other leads were panning out. Candy was slowly becoming the main suspect. Police questioned her several times, but her version of the day and of her relations with the Gores was always airtight. They had nothing to go off, and it seemed like Betty Gore's case was gonna go cold. Or so they thought. Until one day, Allan Gore couldn't take the guilt anymore of his small white lie to the police during his questioning. Allan decided it was time to call the police on the case and admit that he had an affair with Candy, and they ended the affair several months earlier. And just like that, the police had a motive for the killing, which they couldn't fathom whether they were going to end up arresting this bright, attractive housewife. They just couldn't get it in their head that she was able to create such a horrific crime scene. Candy Montgomery was quickly arrested and charged with the murder of Betty Gore. Unsure of what to do, Candy denied all the charges. That brings us to the end of this episode, closing out part 3. This episode was more intense than I think the other two. We went into the details of the killing of Betty Gore and everything that came with that. As we go into episode 4, the final episode of this series, we will go into the trial and where they are now. With that, thank you for listening to this show, and please come back next Monday to listen to the final part of the series. Until then, stay safe. Don't get murdered or murder people, you lovely humans. Goodbye.